Welcome to this special edition of Clot Chat, where we discuss the challenges and issues faced by female researchers as part of our Women in STEM initiative.
I was going to point out was that, there is some basic psychology, and not that I'm in any way a psychologist or know a huge amount about it, but there is differences between men and women. And in terms of putting themselves forward for roles, men are more likely to put themselves forward. And that is, a fact. Obviously, there's people that sit out with that box, and we know that. But generally, a woman is more likely to convince themselves that they're not suitable for a position rather than being suitable for a position, and that their attributes that make them suitable don't quite reach that level. Whereas a man will do the opposite way around. That's the way it's. From the things that I've read, that it's come across.
So I was just following on from Nikki's point, really. So in Australia, because I did a postdoc with Professor Liz Gardner, we had sort of like a promotion-based scheme if you wanted to sort of like go further on, salary increases, and then it goes on to associate professorship. But it's the same sort of point. You found that a lot of the female sort of scientists would look at the criteria and be like, oh, I haven't done this, I haven't done this part or this part or this part. Whereas a lot of the male counterparts were like, oh, I'll give it a try, and then try and talk your way through in the interview. And I think that's tricky, and that comes down to seeing those people in the position. So if you see a female associate professor, you're just like, oh, this is the path that they've done. You're like, oh, actually, no, it is doable to have that family life balance. So hopefully it will start to change, but just a bit slow.
I think following on from Sam's comment about kind of promotion and thing, I think that's really where a support network has to be in place, where management actually actively speaks to their team and identifies people who are ready to go for promotion, to really highlight members of the team who feel that they're not ready, but actually they are. So I think that's really important, is to have that support network in place. I think
this point about sort of differences in personality of people and thinking whether you should or shouldn't put yourself forward and more measured, but you've got to also then put that in the context that there is a massive bias within committees and things anyway as well. And we've seen that, whether that's choosing speakers for a meeting, shortlisting candidates, that's there. So I guess the problem is that on top of this should I, shouldn't I, dilemma you may have personally, you're then going into an unfair playing field. So it's not like you're doing that in the context of everyone else is being treated fairly. Everyone isn't being treated fairly. And I think that makes that, that sort of personality thing, whether you feel you should or shouldn't apply, you get extra penalised for that. This point about sort of differences in personality of people and thinking whether you should or shouldn't put yourself forward and more measured, but you've got to also then put that in the context that there is a massive bias within committees and things anyway as well. And we've seen that, whether that's choosing speakers for a meeting, shortlisting candidates, that's there. So I guess the problem is that on top of this should I, shouldn't I, dilemma you may have personally, you're then going into an unfair playing field. So it's not like you're doing that in the context of everyone else is being treated fairly. Everyone isn't being treated fairly. And I think that makes that, that sort of personality thing, whether you feel you should or shouldn't apply, you get extra penalised for that.
An example I can give you, I was surprised. So, when you submit a grant, you have your colleagues sending you their grants and you read them. And then in your application, you see the recommendation letters. So my recommendation letters sometimes for man, there were 2 pages. Recommendation letters for females were half a page. And that came across to me in my phone and 3 others. And that tells you also when it's also sometimes when you have like a recommendation or a mentorship or whatever, writing half a page for someone compared to 2 pages, like, just saying so many things, it just tells you how much bias it is already starting from this level.
Yes, I just follow on from Steve, really. I think what was good about some of the ones in Australia, so we had 2 that were at the head of the department at the time, who was a male, was very much pushing forward for my supervisor and also another senior PI in the department to be like, you need to go for this promotion as well. So I think that's an important part, to have that support around you, to be like, oh, recognize how much you've done and say, look, you should really go for this, and then helped in the support and the paperwork. And so basically would have like mock interviews and say like, oh, this is what you need to do. And, you know, if you say, oh, I haven't got this much experience, they'll say, oh, no, you've done this, you should put that down. So I think that helps.
Kind of to follow on from that, in terms of things that I've come across, and it's the way to get promoted. Some of it requires, from what you can look, is an awful lot of paperwork. You know, prove yourself to do this and share, which means that on top of everything else that you're trying to balance, you've then got to prove to someone that you'll find, like, so surely somewhere someone should be keeping tabs on this already. And so if you're trying to balance children at home, you're trying to balance COVID, you're trying to balance a research in your teaching and, or, you know, everything going on, at the same time you're then also having to spend your time putting together and, you know, making notes of all the evidence to show that you meet the criteria for the next thing. And maybe it's just, like we said, it's a gender difference, or that there are, you know, females are more likely to then sit down and think, right, I've got to find all this evidence now and go through it and generate it. And maybe it'd be a bit more, you know, maybe it's just like, oh, a couple of words on paper is fine, I don't know. But again, there's that, it feels like there's an extra barrier. Rather than being rewarded for what you're already doing, it's like, prove yourself. When maybe we could think about, you know, just from looking at what people have had to do, you know, and have to do to move to the next stages, it's all about, you know, maybe there should be a better way of like monitoring progress and, you know, and rewarding it as we go.
Sort of really ask a question about was whether we need to think about how we mentor women in academia, and whether that needs to be different to the way we mentor men. And what I mean by that is that we've been talking a lot about how sometimes I think Amanda, you were saying that about sort of pushing yourself forward, or when someone's likely to actually go for promotion, or whether they're actually going to bother filling in these reams of paperwork to demonstrate what someone frankly should already know about what they do. And I found mentoring female colleagues through promotion processes that quite often I've had to sit down and help them, not help them, but talk them through the forms and beef them up a bit, because they've not sold themselves in the same way as a man would. And I can't remember who it was earlier on who said that men would approach this quite differently. I think it was Nikki, would approach this quite differently. And I'm not for a moment saying that all women should approach something like men do. I don't mean it like that at all. But I do wonder whether there needs to be a more positive approach by colleagues in terms of how at any stage of the career as to how these sorts of issues are discussed.